Hume's Newtonianism, then, consists chiefly in his adherence to two principal elements of the experimental method: the search for simple general causes, and the determination to found all doctrines on fact and observation. He aims through the practice of this method to develop a moral science with the same levels of accuracy as, but with much greater utility than, the philosophy of nature. This moral science would be founded on the science of human nature, because human nature is the capital or center of these sciences. In fact, he says, there is no question of importance whose decision is not comprised in the science of man, and there is none which can be decided with any certainty before we become acquainted with that science. In pretending, therefore, to explain the principles of human nature, we, in effect, propose a complete system of the sciences, built on a foundation almost entirely new, and the only one upon which they can stand with any security. Hume's Newtonianism can be summed up as a commitment to some central features of Newton's method, in order to produce a new moral science grounded firmly in human nature. In practice, Hume may not always have conformed with these explicit ideals, but that need not concern us here. The important question is whether these ideals are in any way inconsistent, or even incongruous, with the central principle of natural law. The first clue that they are not is provided by Hume himself in the paragraph immediately following the passage quoted above. For although his talk of building on a new foundation may suggest he is attempting to tread a course hitherto untrodden, he acknowledges that his aim is to advance an enterprise already underway, an enterprise initiated by some late philosophers in England, who have begun to put the science of man on a new footing. The late philosophers in question, not then all dead, incidentally, are indicated in a footnote. Mr. Locke, my Lord Shaftesbury, Dr. Mandeville, Mr. Hutcheson, Dr. Butler, etc. As Forbes noted, this list is something of a mixed bag with some surprising omissions. However, the surprising absences are not Pace Forbes, Berkeley, Descartes, and Malebranche. Not being English, and hence exceptions to Hume's claims, much developed in his later essays, that the improvements in reason and philosophy can only be owing to a land of toleration and of liberty. The omission of the latter pair is the least surprising, but all three failed to conform to the requirements of the experimental method, at least as Hume understands it. Descartes' search for clear and distinct ideas rather than for empirical evidence, Malebranche's occasionalism about causes, Berkeley's rejection of simple general explanations, all these are doctrines which fail the experimental standard. However, Forbes correctly stresses the omission of Hobbes. Although his conclusions hardly commend his inclusion in a list intended to show the virtues of a land of liberty, his approach is adequately experimental. In all probability, there is a simple reason for the omission. Hobbes is rather too early a figure to illustrate Hume's view that moral philosophy, in the modern as in the ancient world, comes to flourish at the distance of above a whole century, after the establishment of a new natural philosophy. Hobbes can thus be classed as a notable precursor of the important recent philosophers, a solution which has the happy implication that his less palatable doctrines can be attributed to the merely partial view possible in his too early stage in the revolution in philosophical method. For the purposes of this study, the important thing about Hume's list is that, with the exception of Mandeville, there are not philosophers antipathetic to the natural law tradition. So Hume's support for philosophers who have embraced the experimental method in morals cannot be spelt out in terms of shared opposition to natural law. There is a good reason for this. Typically, 17th and 18th century philosophers saw no tension between the aims of natural law and experimental philosophy. In fact, a number of philosophers deeply embedded in the natural law tradition explicitly avow the advantages, even the necessity, of the new experimental science. The late philosopher Hutcheson is an instructive example. He sees no barrier between natural law and experimental philosophy, and identifies the task appropriate to natural law theory as the development of a science of human nature through the adoption of the experimental method. This is shown in the short introduction, where he describes the task of natural law as follows. All such as believe that this universe, and human nature in particular, was formed by the wisdom and counsel of a deity, must expect to find in our structure and frame some clear evidences, showing the proper business of mankind, for what course of life, what offices we are furnished by the providence and wisdom of our Creator, and what are the proper means of happiness. We must, therefore, search accurately into the constitution of our nature, to see what sort of creature we are. How should we conduct this search? Hutcheson clearly has in mind an empirical investigation. Now, the intention of nature with respect to us is best known by examining what these things are which our natural senses or perceptive powers recommend to us, and what the most excellent among them. In this art, as in all others, we must proceed from the subjects most easily known to those that are more obscure, and therefore don't deduce our first notions of duty from the divine will, but from the constitution of our nature, which is more immediately known. Hutcheson shows the same commitment to empirical inquiry as a necessary feature of natural law theory in The System. In the opening paragraph of that work he says, "The intention of moral philosophy is to direct men to that course of action which tends most effectually to promote their greatest happiness and perfection. The proper method to be followed is, as far as it can be done by observations and conclusions discoverable from the constitution of nature, without any aids of supernatural revelation. These maxims or rules of conduct are therefore reputed as laws of nature, and the system or collection of them is called the law of nature." Of course, it may be thought that, since these works by Hutcheson were published after the treatise, they may express views designed to defend natural law against the inroads of Newtonian philosophy. However, although it is not impossible that Hutcheson's position in these passages shows Hume's influence, there is no good reason to think he is engaged in a rearguard action against experimental philosophy, rather than simply taking advantage of the resources it provides for better philosophical understanding. The important fact is that Hutcheson's position in these passages is not atypical of contemporary natural law philosophers. This is clearly illustrated by the case of George Turnbull. The year 1740 saw the publication of Book 3 of the Treatise. In the same year, George Turnbull published his Principles of Moral Philosophy. This work announced its aim to be to vindicate human nature. It would do so by reducing the more remarkable appearances in the human system to general laws, and by avoiding any hypotheses not grounded firmly in experience. It further held that moral philosophy is not simply a system of facts discovered by observation. Like natural philosophy, it is a matter of experiments and reasoning from experiments. If this method is not followed, the result is mere hypotheses. Given this much, it then comes as no surprise to be referred to Newton's Principia. Turnbull amplifies these methodological remarks in another work, published in the following year, an edition of one of the well-known natural law texts of the period, Hynexius's Methodological System of Universal Law. Turnbull not only translated Hynexius, but provided also extensive annotations and appended a discourse on the nature and origin of moral and civil laws. In the preface, he describes the appended discourse as an attempt to introduce the experimental way of reasoning into morals, or to deduce human duties from internal principles and dispositions in the human mind. The duties in question are those universal laws which underlie all civil laws. They are the natural law. Hume's enthusiasm for the experimental method, since it is shared with philosophers firmly in the natural law tradition, thus cannot be taken to be a step away from natural law. The natural jurists seem to have had much the same reaction to the new experimental method as the philosophers of nature, the physical scientists. They enthusiastically adopted the new method because its refinements promised more accurate results, and therefore greater possibility of success in achieving their end, an accurate specification of the rules of conduct appropriate to human life. Hume's ambitions are thus, in this respect, unremarkable. The common picture of Hume, the Newtonian philosopher, does not rule out or even discourage the view that he was, and understood himself to be, a contributor to a more complete and accurate natural law account of human society. A shared enthusiasm for the experimental method should not, however, blind us to an important difference between Hutcheson and Turnbull on the one hand and Hume on the other. This difference cuts very deeply since it concerns the actual requirements of the experimental method. Both Hutcheson and Turnbull speak of an inquiry into the constitution of our nature, and by this mean the task of discerning the extent and limits of characteristic human powers and excellences, so that the specific requirements for human happiness can be determined. What is envisaged can perhaps be described rather broadly as a biological inquiry which aims to determine the telos of human beings. Their experimental method is thus a method for determining a final cause. Hume's objection to the role of final causes in Hutcheson's scheme has already been mentioned, and so his conception of the experimental method deliberately avoids any such element. To conduct the science of man properly, he holds, we must eschew all concern with ultimate principles. Instead, we must glean up our experiments in this science from a cautious observation of human life, and take them as they appear in the common course of the world, by men's behavior in company, in affairs, and in their pleasures. Although he does not spell the issue out in just these terms, Hume's view amounts to a commitment to uncover the efficient causes of human behavior, including moral and political behavior. It will be argued below that his contributions to moral and political theory should be understood in this light. Nevertheless, he is not always consistently teleological. To take just one example, his famous remark that reason is and ought to only to be the slave of the passions shows him to remain under the influence of a conception of human nature which goes beyond the merely observable to the idea of a harmoniously functioning system with its own distinctive telos. Such teleological elements may of course be mere fragments or relics, and as such could be discarded to the profit of the whole. If so, the difference between Hume's contemporaries and his own experimental method would be precisely the presence or otherwise of teleology. However, this still would not be sufficient to distinguish Hume's theory from natural law, since not even the main natural law theories are all uniformly teleological. Grotius is a case in point, and this may go some way to explaining Hume's willingness to acknowledge a pronounced Grotian debt. But it also shows that Hume's explicit experimentalism, even when conceived more narrowly to exclude teleology, fails to separate his theory from natural law.